February 11, 1944. The sky above Frankfurt is a crystalline, killing blue. At 27,000 feet, the cold is absolute. Inside the rattling fuselage of the B-17 Flying Fortress named the Iron Maiden, the crew watches the relentless flak burst, black flowers blossoming too close. The oxygen masks hiss, the noise deafening. For 2 hours, they have been flying past the theoretical limit of their fighter escort. They are alone now. The navigator, Staff Sergeant Miller, checks his watch. Every mile gained is a surrender to fate. Then, the radio crackles, unintelligible through the static, but the gunner reports motion. Not the heavy, sluggish profiles of the twin-engined German destroyers they fear. Instead, silver flashes, fast, angular shapes slicing through the high altitude. They are P-51 Mustangs. Miller watches the lead Mustang, its distinctive silhouette impossibly far from England. A cheap, brown paper fuel tank, engineered to be disposable, falls away from the Mustang's wing, tumbling end over end, already forgotten. It is a piece of trash, destined for a German field. But in its descent, it marks the exact moment the war in the air changed. The bombers are protected. For the first time, American fighters have reached the heart of the Reich. This small piece of disregarded technology, a simple drop tank made of plywood and treated paper, had just unlocked the entire air war, leading directly to the destruction of the Luftwaffe's ability to defend the German homeland. The year is 1943. The strategic aerial campaign over Europe had devolved into a gruesome, unsustainable battle of attrition. The planners in London and Washington believed that precision daylight bombing of German industry, the ball bearing plants, the aircraft factories, the synthetic oil refineries, was the key to victory. This doctrine was rigid. The bombers had to fly high, fly straight, and fly deep into Germany to hit the most critical targets. But the execution was proving catastrophic. German anti-aircraft defences, the flak, were formidable. Yet the real killer was the coordinated assault of the Luftwaffe fighter arm. The Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf FW 190s attacked with impunity, often targeting the bomber formations from positions beyond the range of the American escort fighters. The American 8th Air Force flew missions that tested the very limits of human endurance and military doctrine. On August 17, 1943, the bombers struck Regensburg and Schweinfurt. They reached their targets, but at a devastating cost. The losses were crippling, forcing a temporary halt to the deepest penetration raids. The October 14, 1943, second Schweinfurt raid, known as Black Thursday, saw the 8th Air Force lose 60 B-17s destroyed and 17 more scrapped over 1/4 of the attacking force. The problem was simple geometry and logistics. The P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, the best escort fighters available at the time, lacked the fuel capacity to fly round trips to targets like Schweinfurt, Marienburg, or the German capital itself. They could accompany the bombers for the first hour of the mission, shepherd them across the French coast, and then, at the predetermined fuel limit, they had to turn back. This left the bombers, heavy with fuel and bombs, to continue alone into what became known as Fighter Alley, the zone where the waiting Luftwaffe pilots inflicted maximum carnage. The bomber crews had been promised protection all the way. That promise was hollow as long as the fighter escort could not cross the range barrier. General Curtis LeMay's disciplined formations flew tighter, their 50 caliber machine guns spitting thousands of rounds in desperate defensive fire. But discipline could not defeat the German fighters that simply waited beyond the line of American support. The high rate of attrition was unsustainable, and the strategic bombing campaign risked failure unless a fighter could be found that could fly for 6 or 7 hours, matching the B-17s stride for stride, all the way to Berlin and back. This urgent need for deep escort coincided with the arrival of a superb new aircraft, the P-51 Mustang. But even this marvel of engineering faced a logistical bottleneck that had to be resolved before it could truly save the bomber crews. The answer to the range problem arrived in the form of the North American P-51 Mustang. It was a fighter of revolutionary design, initially conceived for the British and powered by the magnificent Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. It was fast, maneuverable and, most crucially, exceptionally fuel efficient. With its immense internal fuel capacity, the Mustang had the potential to fly deeper than any other Allied fighter. But even the P-51 could not reach Berlin and back solely on its internal tanks. It required auxiliary fuel storage. The standard solution for extending fighter range was the external drop tank. These streamlined containers, filled with high-octane aviation fuel, were carried under the wings and jettisoned when empty or when combat began. The critical problem was the material. The most durable and readily available material for these tanks was aluminum, the same material vital for constructing the bombers and the fighters themselves. In the intense logistical environment of 1943, wasting thousands of aluminum tanks on single missions was considered militarily and economically irresponsible. Aluminum was a strategically scarce resource. The first P-51 groups, therefore, were often equipped only with early, smaller capacity metal tanks, severely limiting their escort depth. General Karl Spaatz, commander of the US Strategic Air Forces in Europe, demanded deeper penetration, but the quartermasters protested the waste of critical metal. The Germans, meanwhile, felt a misplaced sense of security. Marshal Hermann Goering, head of the Luftwaffe, had staked his reputation on the concept of the Heimatschutz, the defense of the homeland. He knew the limitations of American escort range. His strategy was simple: allow the Mustangs and Thunderbolts to peel off at the maximum extent of their fuel envelopes, then throw waves of heavily armed interceptors, including twin-engined Zerstörer, destroyer, heavy fighters, at the now unprotected bomber stream. Goering was confident that the sheer weight of fire and armour of his home defence units, operating close to their bases, would bleed the 8th Air Force dry. The Allies desperately needed a large-capacity drop tank that was cheap, abundant, and contained no strategically vital material. The solution was discovered in an unlikely place: a small, specialised unit experimenting with composite materials. They developed a 75-gallon external tank constructed primarily from laminated paper fibres, treated wood pulp, and glue, sealed with varnish. It was essentially a hardened, disposable paper shell. This useless tank, so labelled because it was meant to be discarded instantly, changed everything. It was mass-produced in civilian facilities, did not divert aluminium from aircraft production, and weighed next to nothing. Crucially, it provided the P-51 with the necessary extra range to turn the tide. Now the P-51 could carry the fight not just to the border, but straight into the operational heart of the enemy. The war of production had solved the war of doctrine, and the stage was set for the deepest, most decisive air battles of the conflict. The shift from a bombing stalemate to a decisive air superiority campaign was not attributable to a single factor, but rather a convergence of operational, technological, and human elements. The fibre drop tank was the logistical catalyst, enabling the exploitation of the P-51's superiority and fundamentally altering the mental state of aircrews on both sides. The non-metallic drop tank was a victory of engineering simplicity. While Allied scientists were pursuing advanced jet propulsion and radar, the problem of range was solved with paper, glue, and wood. Developed by companies like Firestone and various small manufacturers, these tanks were constructed by winding layers of resin-impregnated paper and fiberboard around a mandrel, then baking and sealing the shell. Crucially, The raw materials were abundant and non-critical. A single large bomber could cost the equivalent of hundreds of these tanks in strategic material. The 108-gallon capacity fibre tanks provided a staggering 3 to 4 hours of extra flight time, extending the P-51's operational radius to over 500 miles. They were designed to be robust enough to hold volatile fuel, but cheap enough to be discarded instantly without regret. The tank was a disposable accessory that unlocked the aircraft's full potential, transforming the P-51 from a capable medium-range fighter into the ultimate strategic escort weapon. Before the P-51's extended reach, the faces of the bomber crews were drawn, reflecting the grim calculus of the deep raids. The sight of the American fighters turning back was a moment of profound vulnerability, marking the beginning of the most dangerous segment of the mission. This psychological factor, the constant dread of the Abbeville Kids and other famous German fighter groups, was a measurable contributor to combat fatigue and loss of morale. The arrival of the P-51s deep over the German heartland provided an immediate, overwhelming sense of protection. The bomber crews finally felt that the promise of all the way escort was real. For the German pilots, the psychological impact was the reverse. They were accustomed to operating with total dominance close to their airfields. Suddenly, the deep interior of Germany was no longer a sanctuary. When they engaged the bomber stream, they found themselves not facing sluggish bombers, but engaging equal or superior fighters on their own ground, often running low on fuel themselves and unable to retreat to the safety of their nearby bases. From late 1943 into early 1944, Marshal Goering and the Luftwaffe High Command operated under a critical delusion. They believed the logistical bottleneck of aluminium drop tanks would forever restrict American fighter range. This confidence led them to concentrate their most valuable assets, their experienced pilots, and their new, heavily armed FW-190s in the defense of the Reich. They saw no urgent need to commit these forces to the Western Front or the Mediterranean. The unexpected appearance of the P-51s over targets like Leipzig, Brunswick, and later Berlin shattered this doctrine. German defense planning had assumed the air war would continue to be fought at the perimeter. The ability of the P-51s to penetrate and loiter meant the Luftwaffe's strategy of launching mass, coordinated interceptor strikes against unescorted bombers was instantly obsolete. Their operational model, waiting for the prey to become vulnerable, failed the moment the prey brought its own long-range predator with it. The technological enabler, the paper-drop tank, was swiftly combined with a radical shift in operational doctrine by new American leadership, turning a defensive escort mission into an aggressive counter-air campaign. The arrival of the P-51 and its extended range coincided with a change in command philosophy. General Jimmy Doolittle took over the 8th Air Force in January 1944. Doolittle recognized that the mission of the escort fighter was not merely to fly beside the bombers, it was to destroy the German Air Force. Under the previous doctrine, escort fighters were tethered tightly to the bomber formations, forced to remain close and wait for the enemy to attack. Doolittle issued a new aggressive order. The P-51s were now permitted and encouraged to abandon strict formation once combat began. Their primary target was not the Luftwaffe fighter that might be attacking the bomber at that moment, but the Luftwaffe fighter wherever it could be found. This meant fighter sweeps ahead of the bomber stream, fighter patrols along the main approach routes, and deep pursuit of retreating enemy aircraft, even down to ground level over their airfields. This tactic utilized the P-51's speed and altitude advantage. The Americans were now hunting the hunters. This was a critical psychological and physical blow to the Luftwaffe, forcing them to fight on the offensive, which negated their advantage of operating close to home bases. The German pilots, trained to intercept vulnerable bombers, now had to face skilled American pilots in a swirling, high-energy dogfight where every mistake was fatal. General Spaatz and General Doolittle understood the enormous risk inherent in their new strategy. By pushing the fighters to their extreme operational limits, they risked losing planes over enemy territory if navigation or weather failed. However, the existing attrition rate of the unescorted bombers was a guaranteed strategic failure. The new approach was a gamble based on the superiority of the P-51 and the exhaustion of German fighter resources. Doolittle's leadership was marked by this decisive shift from defense to offense. He gave his fighter pilots the latitude and the fuel thanks to the fiber tanks to execute this radical doctrine. The objective was not merely to protect the day's bombing target, but to clear the skies permanently. This meant accepting that some bomber crews might still be lost, but the long-term goal of Luftwaffe destruction took precedence. The fighter pilots, often young and aggressively motivated, embraced this freedom. Men like Colonel Don Blakesley and Major George Preddy led the deep penetrations, demonstrating the P-51's capacity to patrol the skies over Berlin for minutes, challenging the German defense directly. The stage was set for the ultimate confrontation, a series of missions designed to force the Luftwaffe into a decisive, catastrophic battle of attrition they could not win. The new aircraft, the cheap fuel tanks, and the aggressive doctrine converged in early 1944, culminating in a planned series of massive coordinated strikes designed to break the German air defense once and for all. The entire strategic air campaign hinged on the theory that if the Luftwaffe could be defeated in the air, the German war machine would collapse. The technological problem had been solved by the paper drop tanks. The tactical problem was solved by Doolittle's aggressive strategy. All that remained was to execute the battle. The climax began with a series of massive coordinated strikes designed to force the Luftwaffe into the open. February 20-25, 1944. This period, codenamed Operation Argument, became known as Big Week. The objective was to destroy Germany's aircraft industry and, more critically, to systematically destroy the German fighter arm defending it. Over 6 days, the 8th and 15th Air Forces launched thousands of sorties against key assembly plants and component manufacturers across the Reich. The missions were flown deeper than ever before. On February 20th, over 1,000 bombers were launched against targets like Leipzig, Brunswick, and Gotha. The P-51s, riding on the back of their disposable fuel tanks, flew Escort to the extreme limits of the missions. The pilots received the order: find and kill the enemy fighters. The German reaction was predictable and fierce. They were forced to commit every available squadron to defend the factories. The ensuing air battles were colossal, involving hundreds of aircraft swirling over the industrial centres. In the close combat, the P-51 demonstrated its superiority over the primary German fighters. Its laminar flow wing gave it high speed at altitude, and the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine provided exceptional performance above 20,000 feet, the altitude where the air battles were decided. The German FW-190 was a tough opponent, particularly at lower altitudes, but the Mustang could engage it on its own terms and dictate the energy state of the fight. On February 22nd, a major strike against Schweinfurt saw the P-51s engage the German Zerstörer unit, the twin-engined Messerschmitt Me-110s and Me-410s. These heavy fighters were designed to use their massive firepower to break up bomber formations outside of fighter escort range. Now, they were met by the nimble, aggressive Mustangs. The Zerstörer units, sluggish and vulnerable, were decimated. The intense combat during Big Week resulted in massive losses on both sides, but the ratio was definitively turning in the Allies' favour. Over 500 German aircraft were destroyed in the air or on the ground during this single week, and hundreds more were damaged. The German reserve pool of experienced pilots, the lifeblood of the Luftwaffe, was being drained at an unsustainable rate. The climax was building toward the ultimate strategic target, the heart of the Reich, Berlin. The ultimate demonstration of the P-51's new range and the success of the fibre tank innovation came on March 6, 1944. This was the day the 8th Air Force finally struck Berlin in force, a target Goering had famously declared immune to Allied bombing. Operation: approximately 660 heavy bombers escorted by nearly 730 fighters, including a massive deployment of the P-51 Mustang, were committed to the raid on the German capital. The Germans, knowing the political and symbolic significance of Berlin, concentrated their remaining operational fighter forces for a last, desperate defence. The air over Berlin and its approaches became the stage for a gigantic, swirling battle of attrition. The P-51 groups, flying at the outer limits of their range, were not content to simply wait. Following Doolittle's orders, they executed aggressive fighter sweeps, engaging the German interceptors far outside the immediate bomber stream. The German pilots, many now inexperienced replacements for the veterans lost during Big Week, were overwhelmed by the endurance and superior speed of the Mustangs. Over the next few hours, the Luftwaffe was effectively annihilated as a cohesive defensive force. The heavy Zerstörer units, which had been so deadly to the unescorted bombers, were caught in the open and slaughtered. Jagdgeschwader 27, JG-27, and other experienced single-engine fighter groups were decimated by the highly trained American pilots who were no longer restricted by fuel limits. The decisive breakthrough. The critical turning point was not the bombs hitting the factories, but the mass destruction of German fighter aircraft and, critically, their experienced pilots. The final tally for the March 6th mission was devastating for the Luftwaffe. They lost 69 fighters confirmed destroyed, with dozens more damaged. The 8th Air Force lost 69 bombers and 11 fighters, but the loss ratio was reversed. For every Mustang lost, the Germans lost over 6 of their primary defence fighters. The effect was immediate and irreversible. The Luftwaffe had suffered its worst single-day loss of the war in defence of the capital, and these losses were sustained deep inside German territory, where Goering had promised sanctuary. The continuous, deep penetration escort, enabled by the fibre tank, had forced the Luftwaffe into a battle of attrition it was mathematically and logistically unable to win. They were losing not just aircraft, but the irreplaceable human capital, the training and experience of their flying leaders. The skies over the Reich were now open. The myth of German air invulnerability had been permanently shattered, setting the stage for the final phase of the air war. The air battles of February and March 1944, culminating in the March 6th Berlin mission, did not immediately end the war, but they fundamentally destroyed the German ability to defend their industrial base. This moment represents the definitive shift in air superiority from the Axis to the Allies on the Western Front. The immediate casualty figures reflected the scale of the disaster for the Luftwaffe. In the 3 weeks of sustained deep penetration attacks, the Luftwaffe lost over 1,000 fighter aircraft and, critically, hundreds of highly experienced pilots killed, wounded, or captured. These losses were incurred in defensive, high-attrition battles over their own territory. The strategic consequence was the exhaustion of the Luftwaffe's Reichsverteidigung, defense of the Reich, forces. The German command structure now faced a profound crisis. They could replace the aircraft, which were being produced at surprisingly high rates, but they could not replace the pilots. A new pilot required extensive training, often taking over a year, while the average lifespan of a new German fighter pilot in the West was now measured in mere weeks. This reality was quickly grasped by German leaders. General Adolf Galland, the celebrated fighter ace and general of fighters, reported the situation in stark, desperate terms to Goering. He knew that the continuous presence of Mustangs deep over the Reich meant there was no longer any sanctuary. The enemy fighter sweeps deep into the country and has free rein. They are everywhere. We can no longer protect the targets, and we are unable to replace the pilots being lost. The situation is critical. The enemy air force has achieved air superiority. The psychological consequences were profound for the bomber crews. The fear of the unaccompanied deep leg of the mission evaporated. The presence of the P-51, now confirmed as a capable escort, instilled a new sense of confidence and determination, reducing combat stress and improving mission effectiveness. The crews knew they had a champion that could fight and win against the best the Germans could offer, all the way to the target. The paper drop tank, the useless accessory, had enabled the physical mechanism of the German defeat in the air. The long-range escort became the spearhead of the strategic air campaign, guaranteeing that Germany's most vital industries would be pounded relentlessly without fighter opposition. The destruction of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm in early 1944 had profound and lasting strategic consequences that stretched far beyond the skies over Berlin. The ability of the P-51 Mustang, powered by the simple fibre drop tank, to maintain continuous air superiority became a key enabler for the entire Allied grand strategy. The primary, immediate effect was the inability of Germany to defend its own war economy. Strategic bombing, now essentially unopposed, intensified dramatically. Factories producing aircraft, synthetic fuel, and critical ball bearings were systematically flattened. For example, the raids against the synthetic oil plants severely curtailed fuel supplies for the Wehrmacht on all fronts, including for the remaining Luftwaffe fighters. In desperation, the German leadership was forced to shift its aircraft production focus. Recognizing that conventional fighters were being defeated by the long-range escorts, resources were increasingly diverted to advanced, high-speed jet aircraft, particularly the Messerschmitt Me-262. The hope was that its superior speed would render it immune to the P-51. However, this shift was too late. It required massive industrial reorganization and diverted resources from mass-producing conventional, desperately needed defensive fighters, further exacerbating their current losses. The few Me-262s that eventually entered service could not change the tide of war. The most critical consequence was the absolute securing of the skies over the planned invasion site in Normandy. General Eisenhower, the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, repeatedly stated that the invasion of Europe could not proceed without assured air superiority. The battles of Big Week and Berlin provided that assurance. By June 6, 1944, when Operation Overlord launched, the skies over the invasion beaches were virtually empty of German aircraft. The Luftwaffe, decimated and fuel-starved, could not contest the landing, allowing Allied ground forces and logistics to operate under a protective umbrella. Allied fighter bombers and reconnaissance aircraft had complete freedom of action, striking German troop movements, supply lines, and coastal defences with devastating effectiveness. The fibre drop tank, by enabling the P-51 to clear the skies in March, directly facilitated the success of the most important operation of the war 3 months later. The paper tank was not an explosive device or a complex navigation system. It was a simple, mass-produced logistic enabler that allowed a single, brilliant aircraft design to fulfill its destiny. It proved that in industrial warfare, the capacity to mass-produce supporting components can be as decisive as the invention of the main weapon itself. The war over Germany was ultimately won in the American factories, not just in the air. The story of the Mustang and the paper drop tank is a potent reminder that the great conflicts of history are often decided not by the spectacular weapon, but by the unsung logistical and engineering innovation. The P-51 Mustang was the champion fighter, a marvel of aerodynamics and engine technology. But for nearly a year, its potential was hobbled by a simple, mundane problem: how to carry enough fuel without wasting strategic metals. The cheap fibre drop tank, the accessory dismissed by some as useless because it was designed to be instantly discarded, was the true turning point of the strategic air war. It reveals that the war was not merely a contest of courage or firepower, but a profound competition of industrial capacity and the willingness to utilize non-critical materials to solve critical problems. Germany's industrial base struggled under constant bombing and rigid strategic choices, prioritizing complex projects over scalable solutions. The Allies, meanwhile, leveraged their vast civilian manufacturing base to produce the thousands of disposable tanks necessary to enable true, deep penetration escort. The ultimate reflection is on the disproportionate power of small solutions. A simple piece of disposable, glued-together paper and wood unlocked the operational freedom that resulted in the definitive destruction of the enemy air force. It saved countless lives among the bomber crews, broke the German will to defend their homeland, and created the necessary conditions for the successful invasion of Europe. The war over the Reich was not won by a sudden miracle, but by the relentless application of air power, made possible by a $10 paper tank. It is a study in how a tiny logistical victory can translate into a massive strategic triumph, demonstrating that in the long war of attrition, utility often outweighs prestige. The paper tank was an artifact of war destined to be forgotten in a German field, yet it remains the quiet, disposable saviour of the skies.